Welcome to the first episode of Royal Chronicles, the magic and mystery of monarchy. I'm one of your hosts, Hannah, and along with my co-host Luke, we'll be delving into the magic and mystery of the British throne in the 13th century and some of its most well-known yet baffling figures.
We begin our journey back in time to explore the enigmatic life and legacy of one of England's most controversial kings, Richard III, known for his rise to power, dramatic demise, and the centuries-long mystery surrounding his final resting place. Richard III's story is a compelling tale of intrigue, ambition, and tragedy.
We'll also delve into the extraordinary discovery of his remains and the surprising implications this had on the modern monarchy of the United Kingdom. So, sit back, relax, and let's uncover the fascinating world of Richard III and his profound influence on the monarchy that endures to this day. Okay, welcome to the inaugural episode of the Royal Chronicles. Today is going to be quite interesting because this particular story spans many centuries and is still fascinating after all this time. But Luke, you want to start off with introducing yourself?
Sure. Hi there, I'm Luke. I am going to be one of your hosts. I'm not a trained historian or a academic of any kind.
That goes for both of us.
Yeah, we were just both interested in the subject from slightly different angles, and we thought it would be fun to kind of bring them together and tell these stories.
Right. I've always taken kind of an interest in the more, let's say, gossipy kind of celebrity glitzy side of royalty in the modern context. And Luke, well, you've always been just an absolute encyclopedia of historical knowledge, and we thought it'd be a lot of fun to put the two together.
Yeah, I've always been interested in history, mainly 18th century and back in time.
Oh goodness, you
not as familiar with modern stuff.
There hasn't been a century or a monarchy or a royal family that we haven't discussed that you haven't just had books and books worth of knowledge about.
Well, let's get started on our subject for today.
Yes, absolutely. So, Richard III, there's been a lot written and discussed about him. One of the more, would you say, dramatic stories in the British monarchy?
Yes. And, it always helps when your life is made into a Shakespeare play.
Oh, always. Yes. Those are the best ones. So let's start at not the very, very beginning, but the beginning before he became king, and kind of the circumstances that surrounded that and led to his ascension.
Well, starting out, he was the youngest son of the Duke of York and his wife, Cecily Neville. And on both sides of his family, they were very powerful, had a lot of land and power, and were connected to the royal family. So all of his life was surrounded by the politics and the power and all of that. And of course, early on, wars and fighting between his family and the king.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the somewhat controversial, or more than controversial, I'd say, the underhanded way in which Richard came to be king.
So there's a lot of debate on when he started aiming for that. He is, in some accounts, implicated in getting one of his older brothers executed for treason. And then on the death of his oldest brother, the Edward IV, he was named Lord Protector while his nephew was too young to reign in his own right.
And that's the same as like a regent,
yeah,
correct?
Basically.
Yeah.
And right after that happened, when he was declared Lord Protector, his sister-in-law's family basically declared that Edward, their candidate for the throne would be crowned immediately and just cut off Richard being in charge in any interregnum.
Despite the fact that Edward, was still
he
too
was
young.
11.
Right.
So another thing that was odd about that time period is that while cutting him out of power, they seemed to think that he was still their friend because they allowed him to take custody of the prince or king at the time. And then their opponents at court also thought that he would be on their side. So everybody seemed to think that he would side with them, and he didn't side with any of them. He took the prince, threw him in the tower, and executed the Lord Hastings, the other faction at court. The queen went into hiding and took her second son with her to try to hold on to a little bit of leverage for her oldest son. And that's pretty much where things stood. Her family tried to break her oldest son out of the tower. And after that, no one ever really saw him again. Richard sent the archbishop to talk the queen into giving her younger son to him so that he could show up for his older brother's coronation. And that's another thing. No one's sure if he intended to actually go through with it or if it was just a lie. Anyway, she agreed to let her younger son out. And once he was in the tower with his brother, they both disappeared. No one ever saw them again. So no one knows if they died by accident or if he had them killed.
Is this the story?
A few weeks later, he declared himself the legitimate king.
Is this the story referred to as the princes in the tower?
Yes.
I believe. Yes. We're going to get into that a little bit more later on. It will tie in with the discovery of the remains and all that went on with that. Right.
So lots of what you would consider underhanded tactics going on there. Basically kidnapping the king, locking him in the tower, taking his brother from his mom, all sorts of stuff.
What was the story with Richard's father, who had, as I recall, he had been involved in something that was not the same, but because we've talked about before how some of the actions of his father may very well have influenced Richard in some of the schemes that he later was involved in himself.
In a way, you could say that. His father had always basically tried to follow the letter of the law and done everything the right way, and that ended up getting him killed. So all of his sons tended to just do whatever got them to power the quickest way, executing people who were under their protection, attacking without warning, all sorts of stuff.
As one does.
Yes.
At that time. So let's fast forward to Richard's ascension to the throne. He was quite young.
Yes. Yeah.
As I recall. So he becomes king, and
when he became king, like I said earlier, he had both of the princes in his custody. They disappeared, and he declares himself the rightful king because of his brother's marriage being illegitimate. So none of the children are eligible for the throne. And so he's the only one left. So
right.
he's forced to take charge.
Forced. So at this particular time, set the scene. As king, what is Richard dealing with?
So at the time, there are a couple of different factions in England and then a couple outside of England. So inside, you have his sister-in-law's family, the Woodvilles, and a lot of the southern nobility line up with them. They made a lot of enemies because they were just kind of a nobody family until Elizabeth married Edward. And then he married all of her siblings to the most important heirs in the kingdom. That made a lot of people angry because they basically did 100 years of marrying to advantage in less than 10. And then the other major faction was the traditional York allies, who were more or less led by the Earl of Hastings, who, like I said earlier, Richard had executed after dragging him out of a council session, which was completely, that had never been done before. People were always tried before they were executed or killed in battle, not just hauled out and killed. So he basically made everyone inside angry except for the lords who came with him down from the north, the ones who he had gotten as part of his wife's inheritance. Mm-hmm. And he'd been ruling for the last few years. Wow. And then outside of England, you had the Lancasters, who basically by this time were down to Henry Tudor and anybody else who had lost their inheritances during the preceding wars. Mm-hmm. And they were backed, most importantly, by the French king. So he was giving them the money to keep going.
Wow. So it's interesting to point out that Richard was only king for about 2 years.
Yes.
He became king at 30. He died in battle at 32. And you had mentioned earlier his wife, the
Anne
Queen
Neville, yes.
Queen Anne Neville. I only read about her recently. She died, correct me if I'm wrong, at the ripe old age of 28, sadly. But something I didn't realize until we had discussed it was that in addition to all the other things that Richard supposedly was involved in with the questioning of the legitimacy of the marriage and children and things like that, it was rumored that he actually had poisoned her.
Yes. Yeah. There were rumors about that, but also, to be fair, there were rumors about him killing everyone who died during his reign.
It seems that way. The more we get into this, the more it seems that everything horrible that happened around that time, Richard was responsible for it or something.
Yeah.
Did you know that
that actually got so bad that he had to issue a proclamation stating that he had never desired the death of his wife and never wanted her to die so he could marry someone else. So when you have to issue a press release saying that you don't want to kill your wife, it kind of means some people think you do.
Yes.
Normally.
That would raise suspicion, raise some eyebrows. Did you know, actually, that when Anne died, the day she died, there was an eclipse? And I guess people had so little knowledge of that kind of thing at that time, and there was a lot of superstition, and so people took that as like a bad omen, I guess, for Richard's future or something. And that's the story.
Well, a whole bunch of stuff happened right then. I mean, their last surviving child died a few months before the queen, and then she died, so he had no heirs and no queen, and it just didn't look very good.
No. It continued to go downhill. Also, I found it interesting that because this ties in with what happened to Richard later on, she died. She was buried essentially in an unmarked tomb in Westminster, and she didn't have a funeral or a memorial of any kind until I believe it was 2012.
Yes.
When they placed a simple plaque there, but that was the extent of it. She was the queen, or the wife of the king, and that's all she got. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it's really like they didn't have time for any of that. They just put her in and moved on.
My goodness. Okay, so I would say jump ahead, but because he was only king for 2 years.
Not much of a jump.
Let's just trot forward a bit to his final battle, let's say, and his very dramatic demise at the Battle of
Bosworth.
Bosworth, thank you.
So, like I said, he had basically angered everyone inside the country except for a very few lords, and everybody else he was trying to keep in line by either holding hostages or basically threatening them with execution. So his last major rival, Henry Tudor, who was over in France, convinced the French king, Louis XI, to finance an invasion. So he managed to get across the channel and land in Wales, where his father's family is from. So he had some local support, and combined that with supporters of his mother's family, the Beauforts. They didn't meet with very much resistance and started moving towards London. And of course, once Richard found out, he had to immediately start gathering an army together to try and resist the invasion. They ended up meeting at Bosworth, and at that point, Richard still had the larger army by numbers, but they weren't very reliable because most of them weren't actually loyal to him. They were just there because either they felt they had to, or they weren't particularly enthusiastic about supporting the Tudors. So a major turning point in the battle was basically, like I said, there were some disloyal members of Richard's army, the Staffords, who they had a foot in both camps. One of the brothers was on Henry's side and the other brother was on Richard's side, and they switched in the middle of the battle, all going over to Henry's side. As soon as that happened, Richard, nobody really knows why, but he decided he was going to charge the center of Henry's army, trying to reach Henry and trying to kill him in battle and end the rebellion as quickly as possible. But during his charge, they got caught in some heavy fighting and weren't able to make it all the way. He basically made it to Henry's standard bearer, the guy who would be holding the flag, and his horse got killed under him, and he was caught in the middle of all the soldiers. After that, it gets kind of murky, gets a little bit more legendary. The Shakespeare version where he's begging someone to give him a horse so he can escape. And then the pro-Richard version that says he refused to take a horse so that he would be there with his soldiers. Either way, he got killed.
Either way, that's it.
Also, he was the last English king to die in battle.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, and the first one since the Norman conquest.
That is fascinating. I mean, because he died in 1485, right? Yeah, 1485.
Yeah.
That's amazing. Because there were many, many battles after that, technically, within the history of Britain. But he's the last king to have died in battle.
Well, that's an interesting point because this is a turning point in the way that European battles were fought. After this point, leaders wouldn't lead from the front. They would lead from the back. This is where this date has also been used to define the changeover from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance, just because of a kind of mind shift among the politicians in England. You go from, the warrior king to, Machiavelli's The Prince, where, you lead from behind and you're the mastermind of the strategy.
See, if it were me, I would definitely prefer the latter than the former. Do you think the death of King Richard in battle was a major influence in that change, or it was just a coincidence?
I think it was just kind of the last showing of the medieval ideal of kingship before moving on to something new.
Right. Speaking of moving on, as we previously stated, Richard died in 1485, but his story would kind of lay dormant, and there would be many legends and stories about him that would go on for hundreds of years, and he himself wouldn't reemerge technically until 2012.
Yes, yeah. As you said, that lots of stories, lots of legends. He was very useful for the Tudors to hold up as an example of how they had, saved the kingdom from, it could have been so bad, this monster who murdered everybody around him, and we saved you. So they pulled out his story quite often and even commissioned portraits and all
Medieval
sorts
propaganda.
Basically, yes, the Tudors were very good at that. They were very good at controlling the image of themselves and anyone who was an opponent of theirs.
Well, it certainly served them well. I mean, they are another one of the more famous houses, I guess you could say.
Yes, in spite
dynasties.
of having a very short rule comparatively.
Okay, so we're going to pick back up with this saga around the year 2012. But before we get to that, I think we should do a little on this day in royal history.
Sounds good.
Okay, so on this day, the 25th of October, starting in 1415, which was the 100 Years' War. I'm sure you've read a lot about that.
A little bit, yes.
Right. So on this day, we had Henry V with his much less impressive, lightly armed infantry defeating the much more heavily armed French cavalry at the Battle of Agincourt. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yes. Because I have hideously pronounced it Agincourt and been corrected. So thank you, Luke.
No problem.
Moving on to 1760, we have George III. And for us as Americans, we know him as the king that presided over the loss of the colonies.
Yes, the Mad King.
Right, Mad King George III in the Revolutionary War. But on this day in 1760, he officially became king when he took over from his grandfather, George II, which I find interesting because it's not often that someone takes over from their grandfather or grandmother as opposed to their father or mother.
It happens more than you might expect, actually.
Really?
It's surprising when you look into all the different families how often that happens. It's usually, I mean, back in the day when people didn't live as long, you'd have one king who lived a really long time and all of his children would die off and it would have to go to a grandchild.
That's interesting you say that because King George III, who 50 years after, in 1809, would celebrate his Golden Jubilee, which is 50 years on the throne. But mentioning the longevity, he still, after all these hundreds of years later, holds the record as the longest reigning male monarch.
Yes.
But if you include the women, the queens, her late Majesty Queen Elizabeth II bested him by about 20 years. So, but I find that fascinating because there have been many kings since him, and he still reigned the longest.
Yeah. Okay, so picking up on where we left off in our story today, after the battle and Richard's death, his body was taken to a nearby church, the Greyfriars Church, and buried.
Very unceremoniously, as I recall.
Yeah. Just fast, do it quick, move on. Similarly to his wife.
Isn't that odd?
It is. Almost like he earned it. Onward.
We don't want to get too controversial here.
So since it wasn't any place important and they weren't going to put much effort into marking the death of their enemy, a few decades later during the Reformation, the church and his burial site were lost. And nobody knew where they were. The battlefield also was difficult to find because of property changing hands. And of course, like I said, the Reformation, a lot of things were changed on ownership and maps. Difficult to say where the original site would have been. So in the 1920s, I believe, the Richard III Society was founded.
1924.
Yeah. And they started trying to find out more about him and recoup his image.
Correct me if I'm wrong. Richard III is the only king to boast his own society. I don't want to call it a fan club because it's a little more serious than that.
Yes. The only one I know of that actively tries to promote a positive image of a particular monarch.
Well, so from here, and it was many centuries went by not knowing exactly where he was laid to rest. So there were a lot of stories and tales, you might say, that were told about it. But let's fast forward to the year 2012, the Richard III Society and a parking lot.
Yes. heard
all
a little bit
places.
about this story, but like I said, I know more about the past than current times.
That's okay. That's why you have me. So Richard died in 1485. You fast forward to 1924. This is when the Richard III Society was established. And then go all the way to 1975 when a member of the society, I believe her name was Audrey Strange, she stated that she thought that he was buried in under a car park, a parking lot, right? And then it wasn't until 2012, and there had been a lot of investigation and theories during that time. 2012, they begin to excavate, and on the very first dig in this parking lot that someone had predicted would, you would find his remains, the first dig, they find him.
Wasn't the space marked R3?
I've heard that. I'm not sure if that's true. That you can't make that kind of stuff up.
Yeah.
Yes. So parking lot, find the remains. This is where it gets interesting because once they exhumed his remains, of course, there was all kinds of testing that was done, DNA testing, which we'll talk about in a minute. And I know this is a point of contention, but one of the things that they determined was that whoever this person was suffered some kind of, I guess, scoliosis. And I know that's a point of contention amongst some members of the Richard III Society, etc.
Yes, because for so long, the image from Shakespeare and from a lot of the accounts was that he was deformed. He had some sort of a hunchback or withered arm. And one of the main talking points of the Richard III Society was that these were just attempts to vilify him, to make him seem abnormal and monstrous.
I think I read that it appeared that he may have, this skeleton may have had one shoulder that was higher than the other or something. The degree of it couldn't necessarily be determined. But in addition to that, they found where there had been an arrowhead embedded in the spine and other evidence of injuries, presumably from the battle. And
yes, and even some of them were post-mortem. So people were beating up his body after he was dead.
Absolutely morbid to think about. But building on that, the DNA part is really fascinating to me because you have all these people that are so invested in his story and his legacy. And then, of course, to find the remains of a much spoken of, written about, legendary monarch underneath a car park in a church parking lot is just, it's not something that happens every day. And had this discovery been made, years and years before, it would have been virtually impossible to determine whether or not it really was him because DNA testing is relatively new. And, but to me, what's really cool about it is that an individual very invested in this had traced his lineage many, many, many generations ahead. Was it through the House of York, I believe?
I'm not certain about that, but I believe they had to follow mitochondrial DNA.
Yes.
So it would all be through the female descendants.
Exactly. But so that led all the way over to Canada, where they found a very distant descendant. It was a Canadian lady. I believe she had already passed away. And so her son provided the DNA, and that proved that it was, in fact, Richard III, and brought this long fabled story, not to a close, but there was some kind of resolution.
Yeah. I mean, how often does that happen? You get to definitively prove something.
Right. Virtually never. So his remains are discovered in 2012. They determine that it is, in fact, him through DNA testing. And then there's other things that go on between then and 2015. But in March of 2015, he's finally laid to rest as a king ought to be. And I think it's an interesting little fact that during the service, the British actor Benedict Cumberbatch, as many may know as, what did he play in the Marvel movies? Doctor
Doctor
Strange.
Strange.
Doctor Strange. He would later
what's his name?
Sherlock?
Sherlock. That's right. That's the voice of our executive producer.
Yeah.
But he would later portray Richard III in I guess it was a television series, not a film.
Yeah, The Hollow Crown.
There you go. Thank you. But he was at the service, read a poem. I thought that was interesting. But so you have from the 1400s all the way until 2015 that he's finally laid to rest, and that's kind of the end of that's really the end of the story.
Yeah.
For him.
Pretty satisfying
For King
end.
Richard. Yeah. Very dramatic.
Got to solve a mystery.
Yeah. So going forward from here, I think it'd be a fascinating topic to get into for a minute, to talk about, because you and I have discussed this, that some people have raised the possibility of exhuming the remains of other royals, other people. And the late Queen Elizabeth II was fairly adamant that she was not going to allow that. Correct me if I'm wrong.
From everything I've heard, that's basically been the position of the palace since the Victorian era, when the last exhumations took place.
But I've been wondering, because now that we have King Charles II, the third, oh my goodness, the third. Oh, I know what made me think of, go with me on this. King Charles II. When we're going to talk about in a minute, the princes in the Tower, that occurred, what we're going to talk about with them under King Charles II. And now fast forward all this time, we're on King Charles III. And I'm wondering, because he's always been known as having quite a curious mind, being interested in science, and
a friend to the academic community.
Yes, a very cerebral sort of personality. I wonder if maybe he would be more friendly to the idea, more receptive to the idea of exhumations of people that there might be questions about from the far past. What do you think about that?
It would definitely be interesting. I mean, there could be, hundreds of books and doctoral theses written on and further exhumations. But yeah, I don't think there's been any announcement to change the policy so far.
I could see him allowing it as opposed to previous monarchs. Who do you think would be the most interesting person or persons?
Of course, there's the princes in the Tower, and no one's actually sure which set of remains is them.
Right.
So that would be an interesting one to figure out and see where they actually died, or if we even have their remains.
So let's get into that for a moment. The princes in the Tower. And the Tower we're referring to is, of course, the Tower of London, not a place you wanted to be kept basically at any time before it turned into a museum.
Well, actually, that's not really accurate. Before the Wars of the Roses, it was the royal palace. It was one of their nicer residences. And then it started being used as a prison for members of the royal family. And its reputation took a very dark downward turn during the Wars of the Roses, when so many members of the royal family were imprisoned and then executed there.
See, that's how I've always pictured it, a very dark place to be avoided. But give us a brief overview. When we say the princes in the Tower, what are we talking about?
So that would be the two sons of King Edward IV. Mm-hmm. And so his oldest son, Edward V, or never crowned King of England, and his brother Richard.
That we discussed earlier in this episode. Yes.
And they were taken into custody by Richard III and held there and vanished. And no one's absolutely certain what happened to them. There are some claims that Richard had them killed. Then other people have said it's possible that Henry Tudor killed them after he took over. Some people think they may have died by accident or gotten sick and died, and Richard didn't want anyone to know. It's really just a open mystery. No one's really certain.
And wasn't there, it was some years later that there were the remains of two, I guess but judging by the size, what appeared to be children, the remains of two people in the wall somewhere.
Under a staircase.
Under a staircase
Yeah.
in the tower. And this is what I was referring to, King Charles II. He was the monarch at the time that this happened and had, I guess, the remains moved and buried wherever they were buried. I think it was a proper burial, let's put it that way. But I think that would be one of the most interesting cases to look into, to exhume and test and find out, were they not
Yeah, that one would be.
the
Were they
imprisoned.
kids or teenagers when they been taken to the?
They were both children.
They were children.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So were they like afraid that one day they're gonna be like take on the crown or something?
Yes.
Oh yeah, that was the idea. That's, correct me if I'm wrong, that's basically how Richard became Richard III, king.
Yeah,
of
at the
England.
time when they were both taken to the tower, the older one was considered to be the king. He just hadn't been crowned yet.
Yeah. Intrigue,
Dark history.
isn't it? Yeah, so I think that would be the most interesting. There's others that you could potentially
Their father
exhume.
is another one.
Oh, that's a good point. Yeah.
So eliminate anyone that might be a threat to the crown or might be a king.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Clear the way, basically.
But we're not sure who was clearing the way.
Oh, that's a good point.
Could have been Richard. Could have been Henry.
That's true.
Could have been an accident. We're not sure.
I distinctly get the impression that Richard III is, by one side, made the villain of absolutely everything that transpired, but then on the other side, there are those who would say that he was innocent of all of that, and it was other, as you say, other forces at work. But I guess, we'll never really know.
Yeah. Could be just one of those questions that doesn't get answered. So, in summing up, start out with his early life and his rise to the throne, his death and burial and vilification, and then his rediscovery.
It's quite a story, I must say.
Yeah.
It's quite the
Dramatic.
saga. Very dramatic. It's the sort of real life story that's better than any fiction that's ever been written. The kind when people say you can't make this stuff up, these are the sort of stories that come to mind,
Exactly.
right? Well, this has been a lot of fun. A fantastic beginning to this journey that we're on.
Yeah. And if you enjoyed this episode, I very much encourage you to read more about this particular subject and period. There's a lot of information out there about the Wars of the Roses and Richard III, and we've only covered like a tiny amount of it. There are tons of books and other great podcasts that cover it more in depth and from different angles. And I've really enjoyed studying about it and listening to other people's works on it. And I encourage you to do the same.
Absolutely. In addition to that, speaking of other resources, I haven't seen it, but it's on my list of things to watch. There is a film that was made about the Richard III Society and the discovery of the remains and the whole process. I think it follows the lady who was, I guess, the head or the director. She was kind of the driving force of it. But that's on my list of things to watch. But there is a
I
movie
believe
out
she's
there
the one
about
who identified the car park where they ended up doing the excavation.
Could be.
From, I think she compared old maps and she basically just walked the town until she thought she was in the right place.
That is real dedication right there, I must say. So for anyone interested, the name of the film is The Lost King. It was made in 2022, and it's about, the lady's name is Philippa Langley. I hope I'm saying that correctly. Philippa. That's a really cool name, actually. It's not something you hear in the United States very often, but that is the film. It's about the journey, the discovery of the remains by the Richard III Society. We need to watch that together. We should do like a review or something.
That could be fun.
Right? Those are my favorite types of films. Anything about monarchy, royalty, the king's speech.
Well, and true stories that are more interesting than fiction.
As we just discussed, that is so true. I maintain that is the truth.
As we conclude this episode, we want to thank you for embarking on this journey with us. The history of the House of York and Richard III, with all its timeless tales and hidden depths, is a world where power meets passion, where history and legend entwine, and where the choices made by ordinary people in singular moments still resonate today.
The appeal of these stories is not just in its past glories and sometimes dramatic endings. It's in the lessons we can glean from the lives of those who wore the crown. It's in the way we can reflect on the balance of power, the impact of leadership, and the enduring fascination with remarkable lives that give us an image of the past that might supply us with insights on our present. Thank you for sharing your time with us today. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, and follow us on social media for news and latest updates.
Until next time, bye.
The Royal Chronicles is written and produced by Hannah Mohana and Luke Haney. Executive producer Mustafa Mohana.